Thank you. I'm Linda Williams, and Professor Campbell, you've done it again. I told Becky when I saw her this morning, I guess it only was that the last time I heard her talk, she made me cry. And, I'm a tough researcher and all of that. And now as I'm thinking about it, it was 40 years ago this month, so I'm not twice your age, but it's 24 to Elizabeth. But that I started working, it was on my dissertation, and looking at the criminal justice system response to rape cases and what happened to them in case attrition. And we found a lot of the things that Professor Campbell reports today. And it made me think at the time, I was very tired on that day when I heard that talk, unlike now. And I said, what have we done? What has happened in this time? It makes one question, And she did reply that there are some good ones out there. Things have changed. I mean, to sort of take a little bit, we see the trainings that are happening, the changes. You see some jurisdictions where there are some good things definitely being done. But it needs to be made more widespread. So I'm going to take from our other colleague, Dr. Mercy, that today is tomorrow. That this group coming together around this issue of sex trafficking can take the lessons from the past, as can I, even though it's 40 years now, and sort of move to the tomorrow. And it's so great to see you all here doing that. So today is tomorrow. And now that I've outed myself on being 45 years old, because I started when I was 5, I used to say that, and it would mean I was a lot younger. But anyway, I did some research funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, although I'm not really presenting those findings now, so I don't have to do that whole disclaimer thing, I think. But Jeffrey Gersh is in the audience. He was our project officer. And we interviewed youth who were homeless, runaway, on the streets, had been trafficked, some of them, and trying to understand sort of what was happening with them, what happened with their lives. And so that has informed my work. There's a lot more research that's needed. I'm assuming this is the little clicker I'm supposed to hit next. Yeah. No, wrong way. Right. That's my right. I also, because I always just talk too much and get the time signal, I made this last slide, which is, these are my final key points, and then we'll talk about them some more. But just so I get to them. The scope of the problem. We've heard that from a lot of folks today. We don't know the exact scope of the problem. We need more research to count this. Part of it is because our definitions may vary from one place to another when we're talking about sex trafficking. So what is it we're trying to measure? And also, part of it is because we just haven't done that and tried to do it. We also have problems with screening. Who asks the questions? How do we find out? What did we learn when we screen refugees, We need those numbers. So I'm going to say another word or two about that in a bit. The other key point I want to make is learn from the voices of survivors. And of youth survivors. I don't need to reinforce that more today. We've heard some wonderful voices here. But this is really a must to keep in mind, because we must inform our work with the survivors' stories. The other point I want to make today is that cultural norms, and others have made this too, support sex trafficking. That we can talk about individuals, we can talk about dealing with the pimps or the individual, so-called pimp, so-called John, but we have cultural norms that support sex trafficking, and we have to deal with them. Pay attention to developmental issues is another point. Not all the victims are the same age. We need to think about interventions that work for people in different developmental levels. I'll say more about that in a moment. A lot of our interventions have been developed around children or younger children. What do we do with these messy adolescents? And so thus we need to adapt evidence-based mental health services that we know a lot about, because we have worked in this field on sexual assault for a long time. But how does it fit the problem of sex trafficking? And then we need to consider also the cognitions of survivors that they don't trust, that they may not trust, and that they are indeed survivors because they've made it through a lot. And how does this survival that helped them live perhaps need to be engaged in a different way in terms of when we're doing interventions, so that they can be reached and deal with the trust issues. And the other point I want to make today is about multi-jurisdictional needs and issues. The kids that oftentimes we're dealing with, the youth, the young people in sex trafficking, are what one might call, if you're taking a more global perspective, internal migrants. I heard that at a conference, and the guy was from, Myanmar, talking about the internal migrants, and I thought, that's what these kids are too in the US, that they're from another jurisdiction, that they've migrated, and our system wants to know, well, what school can you go to? Where do you live? What's your residence, when you're trying to pull in the educational system? So you have to keep that in mind. So the cultural, well, here I'll kill two birds with one stone. Cultural endorsement and the voices of victims, who we really need to listen to. This was something that a 16-year-old said, and I think said it well, that addresses really the cultural endorsement issue. She was a person who, I just sort of met her at a drop-in center and was able to do the interview, and yet she wanted to help other young women who would go through the things that she had gone through. And she wanted to educate me, the researcher, and she said, let me tell you, when you're a female, you can make any street a strip. And that's what we call it, a strip. Any person, if you look good enough, if you're showing enough, any person's gonna pull over anywhere you are. Do you know what I mean? Do you understand that? In other words, it's like, I'm telling you this because I know from my experience that we live in a place that basically I can go out on the street and someone's gonna stop and pick me up for sex if I'm showing enough, and so there she captured it. This was her lesson, her life lesson, that people wanted to buy her for sex. And I think it's something we need to deal with in terms of our norms. I think it's very interesting, Ms. Pettigrew T, great insight on that too, about the foster homes and how sort of the young people are taught, or their self-perceptions are modeled, perhaps, from the way that they're responded to. Again, not all foster homes are like that. It reminded me of the fact that this young woman had also been the survivor of multiple foster homes, and she said, yeah, I went to that one, and this woman, she was really mean to me, and I punched her. And so then she went to another foster home. And basically the point was, and she said to me, the problem was they just kept moving me from one foster home to another, but nobody ever told me how to behave. Nobody ever told me how to help me to be different. And so she had gone through serial foster homes, and then similar kind of thing. Some guy put her out on the streets. So that's the voices. How many youth are trafficked? I've mentioned this in my pre-points for the points I'm going to make during the talk, but we don't know. It's a hidden behavior, difficult to count. We have some estimates. There are some people in the field, too, and in the world who want to say there's none. This is another one of those overblown problems, that you've made up again, Williams or whoever else is doing it, and that, we won't care about in a few years. And then others who say, no, there's a lot of it, there's so much, it's on every corner. And we really do need good data to count that. We need to know how to screen and detect domestic sex trafficking and how to count it. The ways we have now are very imprecise. Oftentimes police records, the young woman could be arrested herself, so she's not seen as a victim, or we don't know her age, and so forth. So important to get right on that. The other point I want to talk about is who are the victims. Well, I mean, I already said we don't really know who all the victims are, so we need to pay more attention to it. But my perception has been that in this field, in this area of working on sex trafficking, the younger children get our sort of love and attention. We care about them. We want to rescue them. But more often than not, the kids who we encounter who have been trafficked are now in adolescence. They might have started younger. And they're complex. They're harder to deal with. They're not always the sweet young things that we want to come and say, oh, thank you for rescuing me, you know? These are kids who have survived, and they're tough. And we need to pay attention to these adolescents. And this touches on to our theories of adolescent development. And we really need to review these and to expand them, to understand more about the brain development, what happens, you know, at all these different stages of life, and that the brain is still developing into adulthood. Now, in some cultures, you have to go out and get a job and work, you know, when you're very young. And in the United States, we have a more extended period of adolescence and childhood, if you're so fortunate to have enough social support that you can have that longer adolescence. But we do need to understand more about what's happening with those who are being victimized and sort of at different stages. Many years ago, at the start of the child sexual abuse field, Kathy Kendall-Tackett and David Finkelhor and I did an article looking at the immediate consequences of child sexual abuse, and we stressed that we need to pay attention to these developmental issues, that the consequences are different for a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old, and also that if we begin to look at the long-term consequences, there'll be different consequences at later stages in life. So someone sexually assaulted at 4 may have reactions and other things that happen at 14 and 24 and 34. And so when we're talking about the response or the reaction or symptoms, we have to understand there's no one symptom that is going to describe the entire group of those youth who have been trafficked. And we have paid far too little attention to GLBT youth and also to boys, absolutely, to understand more about the consequences for them. Okay, so as a result, because of our focus on young children, and I guess my good colleagues in the mental health field might say we have, you know, tested out our therapies on older kids as well. But because I think we have still a focus on younger kids, and certainly kids who are living in homes or living with parents or getting a parent involved in the therapy, that we need to pay attention to the special needs of adolescents, that the services we have may not fit the adolescent as well, or the late adolescent, the 14 to 25-year-old. And so we have a situation where, you know, we also think, oh, these kids, they've got to get along, grow up, you know, be adults. And we fail to realize that in the United States, very often, or at least among our good friends, you know, how many of us don't have a friend who has their 26-year-old child back home living in the basement because they ran out of money or a job or needed a place to live because their roommate went and got married or something like that. We have those supports. But these young people don't have that kind of network very often. And so they're going to have difficulties later on as well. So we need to look at the support system. I think when I started looking at this area to see what kind of evidence-based approaches we had in terms of intervention and treatment, I thought, oh, let me look at the aging out of foster care literature. Like, I know a lot about, you know, there's good evidence on trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, but what about, you know, leaving foster care and stuff? And there's some evidence on some programs there, but we really don't know what works well with those aging out of foster care, even if they haven't been trafficked, with what works well for this emerging adulthood and this new stage we're defining of development. So we need to devote more resources to that, and of course, specifically to this population. An additional challenge, of course, for the field is when rescued youth, and I've kind of alluded to this, like the sweet young kids who want to be rescued versus and I decided the photo I had up there, maybe I didn't have the rights to or was too revealing, but it's kids on the street. And a challenge for us, I think, is because these kids have messy lives. They pose complex problems when we confront them. It does reflect elements of survival and agency, and the youth, in fact, may see themselves as survivors. And when I first interviewed them, the young people I interviewed, I was really struck by this theme of survival. They said, I survived, I did this, I'm a survivor, I made it through. And it seemed very strong, and I said, these kids are survivors. And they really are, in fact. But they survived, they had to pull on these resources to survive what they were going through, the hardship, the terrible lives. But does this survival mean they can survive through to the future? How do we engage that survival and coping that they've developed and honed to still be alive today, to go with the strengths, but to also engage them in helping to find another way of thinking about themselves and about their life? So we've been talking a little bit, maybe tomorrow in our working group, about these cognitions that I'm a survivor and how that might interfere with the ability to engage young people. Because they're like, no, leave me alone. I know how to do this. And they do in a lot of ways, but what they know how to do is have a knife under their bed, and stab someone if they attack them. That's helped them. Helped. But in the situation they were in. But it doesn't help them today. And so how do we then engage that? And that's messy. And then it's like, let another system handle it. And they commit crimes, it's true. So I have to think about this as we try to understand more about these survivors. So the voices of youth are critical, and they've told us a lot of things about what they want. Good places to stay that recognize their strengths, that honor the things they can do, and yet provide them with ways to meaningfully control their lives, but also to allow to develop meaningful partnerships with social services and freedom from damaging peers and also from harmful families. It may well be, I think I have that on the next slide, well, kind of at the bottom of this, that not only are the youth internal migrants who reside across multiple jurisdictions, but maybe they don't have a family that we would really want them to go back to. In other words, we might have to be thinking beyond our geographically bound service model and our family-based service model, because we may be needing to form other supports within the community that can help them, that has a basement where they can, not an ugly basement, what I mean is the rec room where they can sleep and stay that they don't have. How do we get a community to respond to young people where a family is potentially missing? So evidence-based research suggests that it's important to involve family in the therapies that we do. And so how do we replace this with other kinds of approaches that will use other folks for support and to help them? And there's a lot of mistrust. I think this is my last slide. In summary, we need to provide tested programming for youth and those aging out of the child welfare system and develop policies that really build on the youth's strengths but reduce their vulnerability to exploitation by helping them turn those strengths into something that can create a meaningful future for them. But we can't just say, you'll do this, and because people have told them for long enough, you'll do this. So thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you today, and talk to you.